The night air was heavy, thick with the promise of a storm that never arrived. In a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Philadelphia, the Harris family had lived what seemed like the perfect life. Gregory Harris, a successful lawyer, and his wife, Jessica, were a power couple. They had two beautiful children, and on the surface, everything appeared to be in order. The Harris family was the embodiment of the American dream, wealthy, happy, and seemingly untouchable. But on the evening of March 5th, 2025, everything changed. Jessica Harris, a soft-spoken woman with a graceful presence, returned home earlier than expected from a book club meeting. She was excited to surprise Gregory with a new book she had been reading, something she thought they could discuss over dinner. However, as she approached the front door of their elegant home, she heard strange noises coming from inside. Curiosity piqued, Jessica pushed open the door slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The living room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. She could hear the unmistakable sound of someone panting and a soft gasp. Then her heart stopped. In the middle of their living room, she saw Gregory, her husband of 12 years, lying on the couch in an intimate embrace with their maid Clara, a young woman in her early 20s. Clara had been working for the Harris family for the past year, initially hired to help with housekeeping and looking after their two children. But Jessica had noticed the young maid had become increasingly flirtatious toward Gregory. The sight before her shattered her. Betrayal, anger, heartbreak, all flooded her senses at once. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was frozen in place, her body numb with disbelief. How could Gregory, the man she had loved and trusted, do this to her? How long had this been going on? Gregory and Clara both froze when they saw her. For a brief moment, Jessica saw the fear in their eyes. But then, something shifted. A dark, primal anger ignited in her chest. The woman she had been, the devoted wife and mother, began to unravel. The trust that had held their family together shattered in an instant, and in its place, something darker emerged. A woman capable of acts she would never have imagined. "Jessica," Gregory muttered, standing up quickly, his face flushed with guilt and panic. Clara remained on the couch, her hands trembling at her sides, unsure of what to do. You have to be kidding me," Jessica whispered through clenched teeth, her voice tight with emotion. Her hand instinctively moved to the table near the door, where she grabbed the first thing she could, a small silver vase. Without thinking, she hurled it toward Gregory, the vase crashing against his chest. The impact sent him stumbling backward, knocking over a lamp. His eyes widened in shock, but before he could react, Jessica's fury surged to the surface. She rushed forward, her hands trembling as she picked up another object from the table, a heavy crystal figurine. Clara screamed, but her voice was drowned by the sound of Jessica's anger. It wasn't just the sight of her husband with another woman that pushed her to the brink. It was everything. The years of neglect, the whispers of lies, the growing distance between them. It was all too much. The figurine hit Gregory in the head with a sickening thud. Blood began to spill from his temple, and he collapsed onto the floor unconscious. Clara tried to scramble away, but Jessica was already on top of her. She grabbed the young woman by the hair, pulling her toward the kitchen. Clara screamed, but Jessica didn't stop. The rage that had been brewing in her for months, maybe even years, was now fully unleashed. In the kitchen, Jessica found a knife, a large, sharp kitchen knife. Her hands shook as she gripped it tightly. Clara's eyes filled with terror as she realized what was about to happen. "Please, Jessica, don't," she begged. But Jessica was beyond reason. Without warning, she plunged the knife into Clara's side, the sound of the blade slicing through flesh echoing in the small kitchen. The maid fell to the floor, gasping for air as she clutched her wound. But Jessica wasn't finished. She stood over Clara, breathing heavily, her body consumed by a primal need for revenge. The maid's pleas were silenced by the sound of the knife once again, and this time there was no mercy. Gregory stirred in the living room, but by the time he regained consciousness, it was too late. Jessica, in a frenzy, made her way back to him, her hands slick with blood. She dropped the knife by his side and looked down at the man she had once called her husband. He was still alive, barely. But there was no love left in Jessica's eyes now, only a cold, unforgiving rage. The storm outside finally broke, thunder rumbling as Jessica stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily. Her family, as what was left of it, lay in a pool of blood around her. It was over. The man she had loved was gone, and so was the young woman who had dared to betray her. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, in the chaos of her mind, Jessica made a decision. She would make sure no one would ever know what had happened in this house tonight. She had the perfect plan to make it look like an accident. The knife, the blood, the broken furniture. It would all tell a story, but it wouldn't be the truth. The truth, Jessica decided, would die with them. The next morning was quiet, too quiet for a home that had once echoed with the laughter of children and the bustle of daily life. The Harris family's house, a stately, two-story residence nestled in a leafy neighborhood, stood as if nothing had changed, but within its walls a tragedy had unfolded that would soon shake the entire community. Detective Maria Ramirez stood outside the house, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the scene. She had seen countless crime scenes in her 15 years of service, but there was something about this one that unsettled her. The sheer brutality, the rage that must have been behind the violence, left an impression on her. Maria wasn't one to be easily shaken, but something felt off. She took a deep breath and pushed open the front door, where uniformed officers were already moving through the house, cataloging evidence. The air inside was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the living room, once so neatly arranged, looked like a war zone. Broken glass, overturned furniture, and bloody handprints smeared across the walls. Gregory Harris's body lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes wide open in an expression of shock. His once pristine suit now soaked in his own blood. Clara, the maid, was found in the kitchen, her body crumpled in a pool of blood, her face frozen in terror. Maria stood still for a moment, absorbing the scene. The fact that the bodies had been left exposed was unusual. In most cases, the killer would try to hide the remains or stage the crime to mislead investigators. But this was different. This felt personal. The level of violence wasn't something that happened in a heat-of-the-moment outburst. This was methodical, calculated. She turned to one of the officers. "Who found the bodies?" "It was the neighbor detective," Officer Hernandez replied, pointing to the body outside. She had been trying to reach the family for a couple of days after they missed an appointment. She said she felt something was wrong when she noticed the front door left open. When she went inside, she found the bodies and immediately called it in. Maria nodded. The neighbor's concerns seemed genuine, but there was something else about this case. Something didn't add up. A double murder like this, with such a high level of violence, was rare in a community like this. She moved carefully into the kitchen, inspecting Clara's body first. The maid was young, barely out of her teens, with no sign of struggle beyond the fatal stab wound. Maria noticed a trail of blood leading from the living room into the kitchen, suggesting the killer had moved around the house freely. The blood splatter patterns indicated that the attack had been swift, the wounds deep. Turning away from Clara's body, Maria's gaze shifted to the living room, where Gregory's body lay. His wounds were more numerous, more vicious. The broken vase and shattered glass nearby indicated a struggle, and the position of his body suggested that the first blow might have been delivered while he was still standing. But what really caught Maria's attention was the presence of a large, heavy crystal figurine on the floor, just beside Gregory's body. The figurine had blood on it, though not as much as it should have considering the severity of the blows. Maria knelt down, careful not to disturb anything. "Find anything interesting?" a voice asked from behind her. Maria stood up and turned to face Officer Hernandez, who had followed her into the room. He was holding a clipboard, looking at her with an inquisitive expression. "Who's the homeowner?" Maria asked. "Gregory Harris," Hernandez answered. "He's a lawyer, married with 2 kids. They've lived here for about 5 years." Maria nodded. "Was he known to have any enemies?" "No, nothing like that. He was well liked in the community. Nothing suspicious in his background, as far as we can tell." Maria examined the blood splatter once more, mentally piecing together the events of the crime. It seemed to her that this was not just a random act of violence. It felt like someone had planned this out. The anger in the attack was too intense, too personal. "What about the wife?" Maria asked. "Jessica Harris, right?" Hernandez hesitated, then nodded. "She's at the hospital. She had some kind of breakdown, I hear. She was the one who called the cops after the neighbor found the bodies." Maria paused. The wife, who had likely been the one to discover the crime, was already in shock, perhaps trying to process what had happened. But something about her seemed off to Maria. People reacted differently to trauma, of course, but there was a sense of detachment in Jessica's reaction, an inability to connect with the reality of the situation. Maria's instincts told her to follow up on the wife. If there was one person who might know the truth, it would be Jessica. But she also had to be cautious. People in grief didn't always tell the truth, especially when they were trying to protect themselves or cover up something darker. At the hospital, Maria found Jessica Harris sitting alone in a sterile waiting room, her face pale and drawn. Her hands, still trembling, clutched a tissue that she had been wringing in her lap. "Mrs. Harris?" Maria approached slowly, her voice soft but firm. "I'm Detective Maria Ramirez. I'm investigating the deaths of your husband and your maid. I'm very sorry for your loss." Jessica looked up, her eyes red from crying. She nodded, though there was something in her gaze that didn't quite reach the depth of her grief. It was almost as if she were too tired to care anymore. But Maria knew better. People didn't shut off their emotions so quickly. Something about this whole situation wasn't adding up. "I understand this is difficult," Maria said, taking a seat beside Jessica. "But I need to ask you a few questions. Were you home last night when the murders occurred?" Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting toward the floor. I wasn't home. I I was out with some friends just for a book club meeting, and you didn't return until later?" Jessica nodded. "I didn't expect to be home so early. When I came back, it was just a nightmare. I found Gregory and Clara, and then I called 911. Maria could see that Jessica was struggling to keep it together, but something didn't sit right with the story. A woman who found her husband and maid murdered in such a brutal fashion, would she be able to speak so calmly about it? "I need to ask about the relationship between your husband and Clara," Maria continued. "Were you aware of any issues?" Jessica's face faltered for a moment. A slight quiver ran through her lip. "Clara, she was just the maid. She was nothing more than that." Maria caught the shift in her tone. It was subtle, but it was there. "Did you ever notice anything unusual about their relationship?" Maria pressed. Jessica swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the tissue. I didn't. I I trusted Gregory. I thought he was faithful. But Maria had heard enough. There was something more here, a hidden story that Jessica wasn't telling, and Maria was determined to uncover it. Detective Maria Ramirez sat in her car outside the Harris family home, her mind racing. Jessica Harris's behavior at the hospital had left her with more questions than answers. The calmness in Jessica's voice, the almost too easy acceptance of the nightmare she was living, didn't align with the brutal crime scene. Maria had seen enough crime to know when someone was hiding something. Maria had already requested the forensics team to re-examine the house, focusing on any overlooked evidence. There was something about Jessica's reaction that made Maria suspicious. The question was why? Why would a wife whose family had been ripped apart so violently not show the kind of emotion expected in such a horrific moment? Why the detachment? She needed more information on the family dynamic, and there was one place where she could find it: the Harris family's finances. Gregory Harris was a successful lawyer, but how had he managed his personal and professional life? Was there more going on than met the eye? Maria knew that if there was a motive hidden in plain sight, it was likely tied to money, affairs, or some personal history she hadn't yet discovered. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had come to trust over the years. "Detective Ramirez," came the voice on the other end of the line. It was Officer Hernandez. "I need you to get me everything you can on Gregory Harris's financial history. Bank accounts, credit card statements, anything that could suggest a motive," Maria said, her voice clipped and purposeful. "Got it," Hernandez replied. "I'll get back to you in a few hours." Maria thanked him and hung up, then stared out of the car window at the Harris home. It looked normal on the outside, too normal, but she knew by now that appearances were rarely as they seemed. Hours later, Maria returned to the precinct, her mind still focused on the case. She sat at her desk, reviewing the reports from the forensics team and the autopsy results. Gregory had suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries, one to the head that had caused immediate incapacitation, and others that seemed to have been inflicted in a frenzied state. Clara, the maid, had been stabbed repeatedly, with defensive wounds suggesting she had fought back. But it was the financial records that Maria found most compelling. Hernandez had come through. Gregory Harris had been living a double life. The credit card statements revealed lavish spending on things Jessica hadn't known about. Luxury vacations, expensive gifts for someone named Clara, and even payments to private properties in the city that Jessica had never heard of. There was also a significant withdrawal from the family savings account, a sum large enough to raise eyebrows. Maria sat back in her chair, her thoughts whirling. The affair wasn't just an emotional betrayal, it seemed to have been a financial one as well. Gregory had been siphoning money from their shared accounts to fund his relationship with Clara. He had taken out loans, built a secret financial cushion for himself, and kept it hidden from Jessica. This wasn't just a cheating spouse. This was a man who had been planning to leave his wife, and possibly his children, for another life. And if Jessica had found out, it was easy to see how that would have driven her to the edge. Maria's next step was clear. She needed to speak to Jessica again, but this time, the conversation would be different. She would confront her with the truth about Gregory's secret life. The following morning, Maria returned to the hospital, hoping to catch Jessica before she left. She found her in the same waiting room, her face still drawn but with a different air about her. There was a subtle shift in Jessica's demeanor. She wasn't as outwardly distressed, but there was a tension in her posture, a sense that she was bracing for something. "Mrs. Harris," Maria said as she approached, her voice calm but firm, "I need to speak with you again." Jessica looked up at the detective, her expression unreadable. She nodded, but Maria could see a flicker of fear in her eyes. Maybe she knew that the truth was about to come out. Maria sat down across from her, pulling out the financial records from her folder. She laid them out on the table between them. "I've been going through your husband's financial records. There's something I think you should see." Jessica's eyes immediately dropped to the papers, her face going pale as she processed what Maria had laid out. There were payments to a woman named Clara, large sums of money, gifts, and even travel expenses. There were also numerous private bank accounts in Gregory's name that Jessica had never known about. "Your husband didn't just cheat on you, Jessica," Maria said gently but firmly. "He was planning to leave you. He had been siphoning money from your shared accounts, setting up a life with Clara." Jessica's hands trembled as she reached for the papers, her fingers brushing against them as if the reality of the situation were sinking in. She slowly picked up the pages, her face contorting with a mix of confusion, disbelief, and then something darker. Anger. "I didn't want to believe it," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought maybe I was imagining things, but I saw the way he looked at her. I should have known. I just didn't want to face it." Maria leaned forward. "Jessica, when did you first suspect something was wrong? Was it before or after you found out about Clara and Gregory?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. I had suspicions for a while. I found a text message on his phone a month ago. I confronted him about it, but he denied everything. He said I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. I wanted to believe him." Maria's heart sank. It was clear now that Jessica had been in denial, perhaps too afraid to face the truth about her marriage. And now, in the wake of the murders, the reality of what had happened was too much for her to bear. "Jessica, I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. When you came home, did you see anything that seemed out of place?" Jessica's eyes fluttered, her gaze shifting toward the floor. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I found them, together, in the living room. I couldn't think. Everything just blurred. I saw them and I snapped. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Maria's mind raced as she listened to Jessica's confession. The anger, the betrayal, it had all built up inside her. And in that moment of rage, Jessica had done something unforgivable, but now she was being honest, finally revealing the truth. The confession hung in the air like an iron weight. Detective Maria Ramirez sat across from Jessica Harris, watching the woman crumble beneath the burden of her words. The grief, the anger, the utter helplessness that Jessica had felt, it was all spilling out now. But Maria wasn't sure whether to believe every word. There were gaps in Jessica's story that didn't sit right. "I didn't mean to kill them," Jessica continued, her voice trembling with regret. "It was just, everything hit me at once. I saw them there, together, in our home, and I couldn't think clearly. It was like I was someone else. I just lost it." Maria remained silent, giving Jessica space to continue. Her mind was still processing everything Jessica had just revealed. Murder wasn't an easy thing to confess, especially in such an emotional state. Yet something about Jessica's demeanor seemed off, almost too calm. The wife of the murdered man, the mother of his children, was sitting before her, barely a tear shed, despite the enormity of the crime. Maria was no stranger to shock, but this level of detachment made her wonder whether Jessica was hiding more than just the emotions of a grieving spouse. "I can't even remember what happened after that," Jessica added, her eyes glossing over as she tried to recall the events. "It was like I was watching myself from the outside. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, that damn crystal vase, and hit him with it. Then I just kept hitting him. And Clara tried to stop me. She was screaming at me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop." Maria stayed still, observing Jessica carefully. The detailed recounting of the crime was unsettling, but the lack of guilt or emotion in Jessica's eyes was even more disturbing. People didn't usually act this way after committing murder, at least not in front of the detective. In Maria's experience, the guilt would have been more visible, more frantic. "Why did you kill Clara?" Maria asked, her voice softer but insistent. "If this was about Gregory, why attack the maid?" Jessica winced at the question, as if the truth was too much to bear. She, she was just there. She was in the way. She tried to protect him, to stop me. She was part of it all, part of the betrayal. I couldn't think straight. She had to die too." Maria absorbed the answer, her gut telling her that Jessica's version of the events didn't quite line up. People didn't usually kill out of pure rage without a deeper motivation. And the way Jessica had described the scene, it felt rehearsed, too perfect. Maria stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Jessica. "You said you didn't mean to kill them, but you knew what you were doing, Jessica. You planned it. You said yourself that you grabbed the vase. You could have stopped, but you didn't." Jessica's hands gripped the armrests of the chair, her knuckles turning white. The tension in her body became palpable. "I didn't plan it. I swear, detective, I didn't. It just happened. I found out he was having an affair, and everything came crashing down. I couldn't think straight. It just exploded." Maria sighed, her mind racing as she pieced together the situation. If Jessica had found out about the affair and immediately lost control, then why had she waited until the night Gregory and Clara were alone? Why hadn't she confronted him earlier? There was too much of a gap between the affair and the murders. People didn't usually wait to act on emotions so violent for that long. There was something else at play here, something deeper. "Jessica," Maria said after a moment of silence, her tone serious, "there's more to this story than you're telling me. I can see it in your eyes. You knew what you were doing. You might not have meant for it to go this far, but you planned it." Jessica recoiled as if Maria's words stung. "No, no, I didn't. I didn't plan it," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch, a mix of fear and denial. "You have to believe me. I just wanted to confront him, to get answers, to ask him why he betrayed me, why he betrayed our family." Maria stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Then tell me the whole truth. When did you decide to act? Did you have help?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica stared at Maria, her expression unreadable. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For a long moment she was silent, her gaze shifting to the floor. And then, finally, the truth came pouring out. I knew he was planning to leave me. Jessica confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw the bank statements, the money he was taking. He was planning on going away with Clara. They had already booked trips together. That's when I snapped. I knew I couldn't keep living like that, knowing he was building a new life with her. And then I realized he was never going to come back. Not to me, not to our family. Maria absorbed the new information, her mind processing Jessica's words. It wasn't just the affair, it was the betrayal of trust, the destruction of her family. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a calculated decision that had built up over time. Jessica had seen the financial proof, the signs of her husband's intentions to leave. He had planned it out, and Jessica had finally reached her breaking point. I'm sorry, Jessica whispered, her eyes filled with tears now. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, but I couldn't let him destroy everything. I couldn't let him take everything from me. I thought, if I stopped him, everything would go back to normal. Maria paused, taking in Jessica's confession. It wasn't just a moment of blind rage. It was the culmination of months, maybe years, of emotional neglect and betrayal. Jessica had been living in the shadow of her husband's infidelity, slowly breaking under the weight of it all. And when she finally discovered the full extent of Gregory's plans, she had lashed out. You thought this would fix things, Maria said quietly, her tone softer now, almost sympathetic. But it won't. You can't undo what's been done. Jessica nodded, her face wet with tears. I know. Maria left the hospital, her mind heavy with the confession she had just received. The case was clear now. Jessica had killed Gregory and Clara in a fit of rage after discovering the depth of the betrayal. But there was more to it than just a crime of passion. Jessica had been pushed to the edge, and she had taken matters into her own hands. Maria knew that the justice system would need to sort through all the details. But for now, Jessica's guilt was undeniable. There was no turning back for her now. As Maria returned to the precinct, she reviewed the next steps in her investigation. The forensic team would continue to process the evidence, and the legal team would prepare to charge Jessica with the murders of her husband and his mistress. The case was far from over, but Maria had cracked the surface, and that was enough for now. Maria Ramirez sat at her desk, staring at the case files laid out before her. She had just returned from the hospital after her intense conversation with Jessica Harris, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. While Jessica had confessed, her story still didn't seem to add up completely. There was something about the way she spoke, the way her emotions fluctuated, that didn't sit well with Maria. It wasn't just a simple case of a wife snapping in a fit of rage. Something deeper was at play. Maria knew that her job wasn't just to piece together the confession, but to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. And the truth was rarely as simple as it appeared on the surface. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Officer Hernandez. Detective, I've got something you'll want to see, Hernandez said urgently. Maria straightened in her chair. What is it? I just got the surveillance footage from the Harris home, Hernandez said, his voice tinged with excitement. I think you need to take a look at it. Maria's pulse quickened. Surveillance footage? This could be the breakthrough she was waiting for. She quickly grabbed her coat and headed for the precinct's viewing room. When she arrived, Hernandez was already there, waiting by the monitor. He clicked a few buttons on the computer, and the screen flickered to life. The grainy footage showed the exterior of the Harris family home, the night of the murders. Maria leaned forward, her eyes scanning the scene. The video was time-stamped just after 10 p.m., the estimated time of death. For the first few minutes, there was nothing unusual, just the quiet suburban neighborhood and the occasional car passing by. Then at around 10:15 p.m., the front door of the Harris home swung open. Jessica Harris stepped out into the night, her face pale and her body language tense. What's this? Maria muttered to herself. Jessica looked around cautiously before walking down the front steps and toward the garage. The camera's angle didn't catch her entire movement, but it was clear that she was carrying something. A bag? A large object wrapped in cloth. Maria leaned closer to the screen. This didn't match what Jessica had told her earlier. She had claimed to have lost control after discovering her husband's affair, but now she appeared to be acting with purpose and calculation. Why would she leave the house at all if she was in such a state of emotional turmoil? The footage continued. At 10:20 p.m., the garage door opened. Jessica appeared to converse with someone in the dark, their figure obscured by the shadows. The exchange was brief, but what stood out was how calm Jessica seemed. There was no sign of frantic desperation or overwhelming grief. She wasn't confronting anyone about an affair. She was talking as if she were conducting a business deal. Maria's gut churned. A few moments later, the figure in the shadows stepped into the light. A tall, thin man. He was dressed in dark clothing, his features obscured by the night. But there was no mistaking the aura of familiarity between him and Jessica. They exchanged a few more words before Jessica handed him the large object she had been carrying. It was hard to tell, but Maria thought she saw a flash of metal under the cloth. A weapon, perhaps. After a final exchange, the man disappeared into the night. Jessica returned to the house, her demeanor unchanged. The garage door closed and the footage ended. Maria stared at the screen, her mind racing. Who was the man in the footage? And what was he doing with Jessica? Back in her office, Maria felt a sense of dread settle over her. The footage was an unexpected twist. If Jessica had planned the murders, she hadn't acted alone. Someone else had been involved. But who? And what role did this mysterious figure play in the killings? There was no doubt about it now. Jessica's confession was a lie. The man in the footage, whoever he was, had to be a part of the plan. But why hadn't Jessica mentioned him? What was their relationship? Was it a lover, an accomplice, or something else entirely? Maria picked up the phone and dialed Officer Hernandez. She needed more answers. "Hernandez, I need you to run a background check on the man in that footage," she said urgently when he picked up. "Find out who he is, where he was, and if he's connected to Jessica Harris in any way." "I'm on it, Detective," Hernandez replied. "I'll get back to you as soon as I have something." Maria hung up, her mind still spinning. The case was far from solved. In fact, it had just become more complicated. Jessica had likely been involved in her husband's murder, but there was another person involved, and that person was still out there. Maria had no idea who they were, but she knew she had to find them. Every instinct told her that this was just the beginning of a much darker story. A few hours later, Hernandez called back. "Detective, I've got something. The man in the footage is Peter Cole, a former employee of Gregory Harris. He worked as a paralegal in Gregory's law firm until he was fired about 6 months ago. The reason for his termination was unclear, but he had some personal issues with Gregory." Maria's pulse quickened. Personal issues? It seems that Cole had been involved in a brief affair with Clara, the maid. It was a messy situation, and he was let go after the relationship soured. He's been on the radar for a few months now, but no one thought much of him. He doesn't have a criminal record, but he does have some debts, and there's a history of him being fixated on Clara. Maria's mind clicked into overdrive. So Cole was involved with Clara, and he had a grudge against Gregory. This was starting to make sense. Perhaps Gregory's affair with Clara had more repercussions than anyone had realized. "I need to talk to him," Maria said, her voice cold and determined. "Where is he now?" "He's been staying at a friend's place on the east side of town," Hernandez replied. "I'll send you the address." Maria grabbed her coat, ready to leave. This was the break she'd been waiting for. Peter Cole was the key to unraveling the rest of this tangled web. As Maria drove toward the east side of town, she thought about the events that had led her here. Jessica Harris had snapped, yes, but not on her own. Peter Cole had played a significant role in the murders, and now Maria had to figure out why. Was he the mastermind? Was he seeking revenge on Gregory for firing him? Or had Jessica enlisted his help in a moment of desperation? She didn't know yet, but one thing was certain. There were still many pieces to this puzzle, and Maria was determined to find them all. The east side of town was a far cry from the wealthy suburban neighborhood where the Harris family had lived. Maria took a deep breath as she parked in front of the dilapidated apartment complex, the faint smell of exhaust and stale air filling her lungs. The place looked like it hadn't seen any love in years. The cracked concrete steps, peeling paint, and rusted railings seemed a stark contrast to the pristine world of Gregory Harris and his family. It was hard to imagine someone like Peter Cole, someone connected to the Harris family's world of law and privilege, living here. Maria's boots echoed in the quiet hallway as she walked toward apartment 3B, where Cole was reportedly staying. She knocked on the door, her hand resting on the gun at her side just in case. A muffled sound came from inside, followed by the shuffle of footsteps. The door cracked open slightly, revealing a pair of bloodshot eyes and a scruffy face. Peter Cole was a far cry from the sharp, well-dressed man Maria imagined him to be, given his association with Gregory Harris. He looked disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and a dull look in his eyes. Maria flashed her badge. "Peter Cole?" she asked firmly. He nodded, his face draining of color. "Yeah, what do you want?" "I'm Detective Maria Ramirez. We need to talk," she said, her voice unwavering. "We've got some questions about your involvement with Gregory and Clara Harris." The name Clara seemed to register with him, and he flinched, his eyes flickering with something. Guilt, maybe fear. "I already told you everything I know. I'm not involved in any of this," he muttered, his voice shaky. Maria didn't buy it. She stepped into the apartment, not waiting for an invitation. The place was small, sparsely furnished, with an overwhelming smell of cigarettes and stale beer. The TV in the corner was playing some low-budget crime drama, its volume barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. Peter looked at her, his face contorting into a mix of nervousness and disbelief. "What do you want from me? I told you, I had a thing with Clara a while back. I didn't kill anyone." Maria folded her arms across her chest, standing tall. "I know you're lying. You weren't just some jilted lover. You're involved in the murders of Gregory and Clara Harris, and I want to know how." Peter shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the floor. "I didn't hurt them. I swear. You got it all wrong." Maria wasn't convinced. "Then explain the footage we found. You were at the Harris house that night. You met with Jessica Harris in the garage. You took something from her. What was it?" Peter's face turned pale, and for a moment he seemed frozen in fear. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally he spoke, his voice trembling. "I didn't know it would go that far," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want anyone to die. I just wanted to help her." Maria's curiosity piqued. "Help her with what? What did you think was going to happen that night?" Peter sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. "Jessica came to me just a few days after she found out about Gregory's affair. She was angry. I mean, she was furious, you know? And she wanted revenge. She knew about Clara and me, and she thought we were all plotting against her. She begged me to help her, to make Gregory feel what she felt." Maria listened intently, her mind working to piece together the puzzle. "I didn't want any part of it. I didn't want to get involved in anything that could hurt people. But she wouldn't stop calling me. She kept saying that if I didn't help, she would tell everyone about Clara and me." Peter continued. "She knew about us. She had proof. So she blackmailed me. I didn't want to be dragged into her mess, but eventually I agreed. She said she had a plan to confront Gregory and Clara at the house, and she wanted me to be there." Maria's mind raced. Blackmail. Jessica had blackmailed Peter Cole into helping her. But it wasn't just that. This was a deeper web of betrayal, manipulation, and desperation. "So, you helped her plan it?" Maria asked. Peter nodded reluctantly. "Yeah. She said she wanted to make sure Gregory would never leave her for Clara. She said she wanted him to pay for everything he did to her, to their family. She wanted him to know how it felt, to be betrayed. She said she couldn't do it alone, and she needed my help. But the murders, you didn't think it would go that far?" Maria pressed, narrowing her eyes. Peter's expression twisted with guilt. "I swear I didn't know she was going to kill them. I thought she just wanted to scare them, make them suffer a little. She kept telling me it was going to be a confrontation. But when I left, I thought I was done. I didn't know what she was going to do after that." "Where did you go after you left the house?" Maria demanded, her voice sharp. Peter hesitated for a moment. "I went to the bar. I didn't want to be part of the mess anymore. I tried to put it out of my head, but I couldn't. I was too damn scared. She'd already crossed a line. I should have never gotten involved." Maria's mind was racing as she processed the information. Jessica had roped Peter into her plan, but it wasn't clear whether Peter had fully understood her intentions. What was clear was that he had been there to assist, albeit reluctantly, in some capacity. His involvement was undeniable, but it was equally clear that he wasn't the mastermind. "Did you talk to her after that night?" Maria asked, eyeing Peter closely. He shook his head. "Number, I didn't. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore." Maria's mind was starting to piece the story together, but the more she learned, the more questions arose. Peter Cole wasn't the key to understanding the full extent of Jessica's actions, but he was a significant player in the series of events that led to the murders. "Peter, I need you to come down to the precinct for further questioning," Maria said firmly. "You're not off the hook yet. You may not have killed them, but you were part of something much bigger than you realized." Peter's face dropped, his expression a mix of fear and regret. "I didn't mean for anyone to die." Maria didn't respond. The truth was starting to unravel, and with each new piece it became more evident that Jessica Harris was the center of it all. She had orchestrated a plan that involved blackmail, betrayal, and ultimately murder. As Maria left the apartment, she felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on her shoulders. The case was far from over, but now it was becoming clear that Jessica Harris had orchestrated a twisted scheme, manipulating Peter Cole into helping her exact a brutal revenge on her husband and his mistress. But what had truly pushed Jessica to such lengths? What had driven her to betray her own family in such a violent and calculated way? The answers weren't far off, and Maria was determined to find them. The air felt thick with tension as Maria sat in her car, parked outside the Harris family home. The investigation was nearing its end, and everything was starting to come together. She had gathered the facts, pieced together the events leading up to the murders, and uncovered Peter Cole's reluctant involvement. But there was still one person who held the answers: Jessica Harris herself. Maria had spent days digging into the past, interviewing witnesses, and sifting through evidence. But it was the face-to-face confrontation with Jessica that would finally bring the truth into the light. She needed to understand what had pushed a mother and wife to cross the line into such brutal violence. What had happened in the dark recesses of her mind that had turned her from a woman scorned to a cold-blooded murderer? Maria exhaled sharply, her eyes fixed on the front door of the Harris home. The house was quiet now, the silence only broken by the occasional car passing by. It seemed surreal that a family so seemingly perfect, living in a home that radiated comfort and wealth, had been shattered by such unimaginable violence. She had already spoken to Jessica once, but that conversation had been nothing more than a desperate attempt at damage control. Now, armed with the full scope of the investigation, Maria was ready to press her harder. She needed to uncover the last layer of deception. Maria could feel that Jessica had more to reveal, and she wasn't about to let her get away with lying her way out of this. Maria walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell. A moment later, Jessica appeared in the doorway, her eyes dull and hollow, as though the weight of everything she had done was finally sinking in. Her once impeccable appearance was now disheveled, her hair falling limp around her face. She looked like a woman who had lost everything. "Detective," Jessica said, her voice hoarse, "I didn't think I'd see you again." Maria's gaze hardened. "We need to talk, Jessica. You've lied to me, and now it's time to tell the truth." Jessica's face twitched, her eyes darting around nervously. "I already told you everything I know," she replied, almost pleading. I didn't mean for it to happen. You didn't mean for it to happen?" Maria cut her off, her voice calm but firm. "You planned it, Jessica. You lied, manipulated, and dragged others into your web of revenge. You didn't just snap, you orchestrated the entire thing. The only question left is why." Jessica's expression faltered, her shoulders sagging. I loved Gregory. I loved him more than anything, but he didn't love me the way I needed. He betrayed me, humiliated me, and I couldn't just let it go. I wanted to show him how much he hurt me. I wanted him to feel it, just like I did." Maria stared at Jessica, her eyes searching for any shred of remorse or guilt. But all she saw was bitterness and a twisted sense of entitlement. "You had an affair, Jessica, and then you turned to Peter Cole. He was your pawn in this game of revenge. But you took it too far. You killed him. You killed your husband and Clara," Maria said coldly. Jessica shook her head, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want anyone to die. I just wanted him to know what it felt like to be betrayed. I wanted him to pay for everything. But when I saw him there, when I saw him with Clara, it was like something snapped. I couldn't control it anymore. Maria's gut twisted. She had heard stories of people being driven to the edge by betrayal. But this was something else entirely. Jessica had crossed a line no one should ever cross. And now she was paying the price. You can't undo what you've done, Maria said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. You've taken lives, your children. They'll never be the same again. What happens to them now, Jessica? Jessica's face crumpled. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared down at the floor, her entire body shaking. I didn't think about them. I didn't think about anything but my pain. I was so consumed by it. I don't even know who I am anymore. Maria's heart hardened. You made a choice, and now you have to face the consequences. Jessica looked up at Maria, her expression broken. I didn't mean to destroy everything. I thought if I just showed him the pain, maybe he would understand. Maybe he would love me again. Maria stepped closer, her voice steady but resolute. That's not how it works, Jessica. You can't force love, and you can't force someone to stay. You had a choice. You chose violence, and now you're going to pay for it. There was a long silence between them, the weight of Maria's words hanging in the air. Jessica didn't speak. She simply stood there, defeated, as though the life she had known was slipping through her fingers. Maria took a deep breath and turned toward the door. She had everything she needed now: the confession, the evidence, the understanding of the motive behind the killings. Jessica had confessed to the murders of her husband and Clara, and while Maria could feel a pang of empathy for the pain that had driven her to such extremes, there was no escaping the fact that she had crossed a line that could never be undone. Maria stepped outside, the cold night air hitting her face. She glanced back at the Harris home one last time before getting into her car. The case was officially closed. But as she drove away, her mind kept returning to the faces of Gregory and Clara, and to the children who had been left behind in the wake of such violence. It was a tragic end to a story of love, betrayal, and murder. As the investigation came to a close, the Harris family's story was forever etched into the annals of tragedy. Jessica Harris, once a beloved wife and mother, was arrested for the brutal murders of her husband and their maid. Her motives, driven by a twisted desire for revenge and a broken heart, had spiraled out of control, culminating in an act of horrific violence that no one could have predicted. Peter Cole, too, would face charges for his role in the crime. Although he hadn't killed anyone, his involvement in the plot to torment Gregory and Clara made him an accomplice, and he would face justice for his actions. For the children of the Harris family, life would never be the same. They would grow up in a world that had been forever shattered by the actions of their mother. The trauma of losing both parents in such a violent way would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And for Detective Maria Ramirez, the case would be another reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath even the most seemingly perfect lives. People weren't always what they seemed, and the human capacity for cruelty was far more terrifying than she had ever realized.